Hey, happy Friday. Welcome back to another Friday Tech Workshop. I'm Joseph, a senior developer advocate with AppSmith, and this week we're going to take a look at the structured outputs feature from OpenAI's API. This is available on the chat completions endpoint and the assistant endpoint, depending on which model you use. So structured outputs is a way that allows you to define the JSON response format to ensure it's compatible with your workflow or your database so that you can specify every single field, the allowable values, and everything about that structure. Now, before this feature, they did have a JSON mode, which allowed you to request the response in JSON, but there was no way to actually define the structure, like which values were allowed for a certain field, for an enum, or what the data type was. So now with structured outputs, you can define every piece of that response using a JSON schema. So today we're going to use that structured output feature, and we'll send in some data from a customer review. I'm using some mock data from a hotel chain review. And when we send that data in, we're only going to have the review text itself and a number rating, 1 through 5. But we want to extract other data, like what's the sentiment of this? Is it positive or negative? Is there offensive content in here? Are there any keywords or tags that we can use to filter these reviews later? So we'll define the JSON schema for the extra data points that we want to add to ensure that the response fits that format and reduce the chances of any hallucinations. This will make the output much more compatible with the next step of your workflow so that you don't have to transform the data or pre-process it before sending it off to your database or to another API or workflow. So first, let's check out how to create the API key in OpenAI. Then we'll save that as a data source in AppSmith and set up an API for the chat completions endpoint where we can apply the JSON schema. All right, let's check it out. Okay, here's a quick preview of what we're going to build today. I've got a table here with some mock reviews, and when I select one of them, it sends that off to the OpenAI chat completions endpoint with a JSON schema to define that structured output. And then it's returning this specific set of fields where we have a sentiment that must be the word negative or positive, offensive content, which must be true or false. We are pulling in that same rating, username, and review text and timestamp, and then also adding in some tags. So these extra fields are defined with the exact allowable values, which ones are required and which ones are optional. And this makes the response much more reliable so that you can pass it on to the next phase of your workflow or save it to a database or API, and you know that it'll match that expected structure for the next system. So it's a lot less pre-processing that you have to do. You don't have to validate the data or do all these checks before sending it off to the next step. So I've got some extra data points here. The big one is like the offensive content. I have it set up to check the text so that you could get an alert of maybe if you want to remove this content or flag it. Same with like the negative sentiment where you might want to reply right away and offer some type of resolution to address those negative ones when they come in. So a lot of things you could do with this data once you have it. This could trigger a workflow. It could just get saved back to a database for analytics. So what we're going to do today is start from scratch and build this out. First thing would be to create an OpenAI API key. So head over to the OpenAI dashboard and you go to API keys here on the left sidebar and then create new secret key. And then here, just give it a name and leave the rest of this as is. So let's create the key and then save that in an AppSmith data source. I'm going to skip past actually creating that because I've got mine set up already, but this is where you can create that key. And once you get to the next screen and it shows the key, just leave that open for a minute while you set up the data source. You're only going to be able to access that API key one time in OpenAI. So you want to make sure that you get it saved into the AppSmith data source before you close or dismiss that window. So you got your API key ready, then head over to the app. And I'm going to start out with a new blank page here. So from here, you want to go to Data on the left sidebar, click the plus to add a new data source, and then choose Authenticated API. So the regular API is just like Postman, all of the variables, the headers, authentication, everything would just be in a text field right there. But we want to set this up so that the authentication is on the server and securely store that key outside of the app. We do not want that API key in the app itself. So you create an authenticated API, and I have a tutorial on the portal that lists all the details for this. So I'm just going to pull that up. And if you go to create this new data source, then there's a table here showing we want to give that data source a name. I like to put my own name in there as well when I'm working with a team, but just give it something so that you know what it is in the editor. Then you set the root URL to the domain, but you don't need everything after that. That'll be in the individual APIs. Okay, and then you'll want to set the authentication type to bearer token, which opens up the bearer token field, and then you can paste in your key. So here it is, authentication type bearer token. Paste your token in here, and you'll see that this field is encrypted with the green lock icon here. So just like in OpenAI, once you see that value once and close that window, that's it. You're not going to be able to view it in either platform again. If you do come back and edit the data source, that's going to be blank. So you don't want to save it again. You'll have to generate a new key or have that backed up somewhere else. So just make sure that you don't dismiss that window until you've got it saved as a data source. Click save, and then you can go on to create APIs actually using that data source. So that's the one thing I'm going to skip because I've already got a key created and I have the data source set up already. So I'm going to add a new API under that data source. Now, I've got a bunch of data sources in my account, but you should see the one you just created here at the top. You select that and create a new API to send a message. And we'll be sending it to that endpoint for the chat completions. So back to the tutorial here. Once you've set up the data source itself, then you create this API under that data source. It should be a post API, and the endpoint is this v1 chat completions. I'm going to copy that, and we'll just put that after the URL here. Make this a post request, and we're changing the body to JSON. And then I've got just a simple message body here. This is about as simple as it can get with the minimal fields. You need to specify what model that you want to use. The messages, which can be just the user message, or you can throw in a system message here as well. But that's it. The header that we need for the authentication, that bearer token, is going to be inherited from the data source. When you see this blue bar around the URL, that's showing that it's attached to a data source and inheriting some extra headers, authentication, query parameters, whatever it is that you add to that data source. So we'll go ahead and run this, and we should get back a response, but we're not using structured outputs yet. Might also have to increase the timeout. You saw this one actually worked out fine, but as we give it more complex prompts, we're probably going to have to up this timeout. So I'm going to do that now. And I'm just going to set that to a full minute. So you can see we got back a response here, and it's talking about structured outputs. So that much is working, but we're not actually using it. I just asked it that question. What is a structured output? So let's go back to the tutorial here. Once you run that and you've got authentication working and whatnot, next thing is I want some review data to work with. So we're going to add some mock data in a new JSON object. I'm going to copy this and go to the JS tab here, add a new JS object, and paste this in here. And I'm just going to name this mock data because we're going to have a few JS objects here. So now that we have an array of records here, array of objects, I'm going to display that in a table. So we'll go to the UI tab, we'll drag in a new table widget here, and then connect this to, so this isn't a query, it's not showing up directly in the list here, but if you switch to JS mode, now we can reference that in a binding here, and we'll just go to that mockdata.reviews array. So here's our array of mock data. I'm just going to move the timestamp around here so we can see more of the review text. And we'll make that cell wrapping as well. There we go. So I want to take the selected row. and pass that in as part of the prompt so that the AI knows I want to use this row. And with each row click on row selection, we'll rerun that chat, that send message. So back to the table itself here, because I was inside a single field. If you go to the row selection section, we'll turn on row selected and tell that to run the query send message. So every time we select a row, it'll rerun that. And then I want to view that response. So I'm going to take a text widget here, and we will reference the response coming back from send message. So that's send message.data, and then in there is a choices array. And we want to look at the index 0 choice. So that is dot choices 0. And then inside of there, we have a message object, which has a content and a role. So we want to display that content. And so now we're looking at the data coming straight back from the AI, from the assistant. And this is the text part of the response, the main response itself. I'm just going to adjust the style here, and we will make this small and get rid of the bold text. So we've got it set up now to where every time I select a row, it's going to rerun, but it's still talking about just a general question, what is structured outputs? Now I want to pass in the data from the selected row, and so we need to update this body to actually use that in the message. And I've got that typed out here just to save us a bit of typing. We're going to use the content will just be the JSON.stringify of the entire row. So back here, paste this in, and you can see that we're taking the object, that entire selected row object, stringifying it so that it's in the right format, and then that just becomes a string of the user's prompt. So here I'm telling the system that its job is to extract structured data from online reviews, and then as the user, I'm providing that review. So now if we run this, okay, and let's go back to the UI to view it and just test that row selection. So we'll check another one here. And so you can see I'm getting back an object now. It's a little tough to read though. It's all minified. There's no indentation, no line returns. So we can make this a little more readable by using JSON parse, but first it has to be actual JSON, and right now it's a string. So it seems a little redundant, but we have to actually turn it into JSON and then back into a string to add that indentation. So I'm just going to update this binding here, and then we'll kind of walk through how this works. So you can see now that we have the line returns and a little bit of an indent here for each level of the object. And what this is doing is taking the initial response from the API, and it's using JSON.parse on it to turn the string version of the JSON coming from the API into real valid JSON. Once that's done, that can then be sent to JSON stringify to change it back to a string with this third parameter for the number of spaces that we want. So if I change this to 4, then you'll see that it just moved the indent here. We can change it to 8 just to make it a little more visible. So this is telling it how to stringify it and how to structure that indentation. And then this second parameter that we're skipping is it's undefined. That's a replacer function. It's not used very often in Stringify, but in the process of stringifying the data, you could pass in a function that tells it how to apply some formatting, maybe capitalize everything or whatever you want to do. So we've got that displaying the response now. And when I select a different row, it'll send that raw review data and come back with some structured data telling me exactly how that review was, is it positive or negative, and what other fields are in there. But we're not using structured data yet. It is sending the review, and it is returning JSON. Here it's got a comments field and a positive, an array here. So let's check out the next one. Okay, this has a comments object and then positive, negative. So it's trying to do some type of structured data, but it's really just coming up with its own format. I didn't give it much of a prompt at all or a description of what that structure is. So the response is trying to be structured, but we really need to tell it exactly what structure we want so that it's predictable and compatible with our system. So we're almost there. This is where it gets a little tricky into the exact formatting of how a JSON schema works. And I don't want to get too much into that. I'm just going to give you an example that works. And then you can adjust that from there for your own schema. Now, the JSON schema, it's a little complex, it's a little long. So I'm just going to copy this into a separate JS object so that we can reference it in the API body and just separate it out to make it easier to work with. So we'll add one new JS object, paste this in here, and I'm going to name this one JSON schema. And so what this is an object. This object defines all of the fields that we want in our response. So it has a name, and then it has a schema. And then that schema is type object, which means the top level return value should be an object. And then within that object, there are other fields. We have a username, which is a string. The rating is a number. When we get to sentiment here, I'm defining it as a string of enums. So it has to be one of these values, positive, neutral, or negative. Tags is an array of strings, but I'm not giving it any hard-coded values. So you can be really specific with this, and you can be specific in a way that is kind of flexible. Like I'm telling it, I need an array of tags, but I'm letting the assistant come up with those tags. Whereas here, I'm saying you have to pick one of these. So like I said, there's a lot to JSON schema. I don't want to turn this into a big lesson on all the formatting there, but you can define a JSON schema. There's some tools online that'll help you build them and define them, or you can just ask ChatGPT to do it. That's actually how I got this one working. So some way you come up with this JSON schema that defines the structure of the data you want to get back. Now that I have this, we want to go back to the query and include that in the request itself. So you've got this messages array, and right here after the array, you also want to tell it the response format. So let's go back here one last time to the tutorial, and you can see I've got the end of the messages array, and then just a couple lines here that says the response format should be a JSON schema type, and then here is the JSON schema. So we'll copy all of this, put that back in here, and so we're taking the data from that file that I just created, the JSON schema.data right here. And so this just makes it easier to work with because otherwise this is massive. When you look at the table row that we're passing in here, there's that object from the rating, and then now you've got this massive JSON schema object here that's nested. So rather than try to type all that here and get the exact placement of everything right, I think this is a little more readable. You just have your messages array and then this response format object with two properties, type and then JSON schema, and then you give it that schema. Now that schema is where it gets a little more complicated, but let's go ahead and run this. We'll do it from the UI again. So you can see here we've got a comments object. I didn't ask for that. A field called positive, that's an array, and a array called negative. So it tried to do some kind of structure, but it's not the structure I wanted. Now we should actually have a defined structure. So here's our offensive content, and it's a Boolean field, true or false. Sentiment is a enum. It has to be the word negative, neutral, or positive. And so now this is predictable. It's going to match your expected format. You don't have to transform the data. So if you want to send that off to an API, you can define your schema to match that API, or match your database that you're sending it to, or make up a new schema because you want to save this to a new table. So it's very flexible and it makes everything more predictable. It reduces the chances of hallucination. So I think that's everything I wanted to show for this week. This is a really useful feature. It allows you to leverage that power of LLMs without all of the, trouble with hallucinations and repeatability. So that's the new structured outputs feature from OpenAI. I hope this has been helpful. If you have any questions or comments on this workshop, feel free to drop a comment below. So thanks again for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you next week.